The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the American Embassy in Valancia. As senior security officer, Kath Miller adjusted the strap of her weathered leather holster. At 44, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that survival often depended on being underestimated. Her colleagues were already gathering for the monthly weapons qualification, their voices echoing off the embassy's imposing walls as they compared their latest tactical gear and state-of-the-art firearms. What none of them knew was that in less than 6 hours, Kath's antique weapon would be the only thing standing between a terrorist cell and an international catastrophe that would reshape American foreign policy forever. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The embassy's underground firing range buzzed with the familiar energy of competitive federal agents showing off their equipment. Kath descended the concrete stairs, her soft-soled boots making barely a whisper against the polished floors. The basement facility was a stark contrast to the ornate diplomatic offices above all business, with reinforced walls, advanced ventilation systems, and enough firepower to outfit a small army. Well, look who finally decided to join us," called out Agent Derek Thompson, a broad-shouldered man in his early 30s whose pristine tactical vest gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Fresh from his assignment at the FBI's hostage rescue team, Thompson had arrived at the embassy 6 months ago with an ego that preceded him through every doorway. His Sig Sauer P320 sat in a custom holster that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Kath nodded politely and made her way to the equipment check-in station, where Agent Sarah Chun was inspecting her own weapon, a sleek Glock 19 with enough modifications to make it look like something from a science fiction movie. Red dot sight, tactical light, extended magazine, custom grip, every possible upgrade that money could buy. "Morning, Sarah," Kath said quietly, beginning her own equipment inspection with practiced efficiency. "Oh my God, Kath," Sarah laughed, gesturing toward the holster at Kath's hip. "Please tell me you're not actually planning to qualify with that museum piece again." The conversation caught the attention of the other agents in the range. Agent Marcus Williams, a former SWAT commander from Detroit, set down his modified H&K VP9 and approached with the swagger of someone who'd never met a tactical situation he couldn't solve with superior firepower. "What are we looking at?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the punchline to whatever joke was about to unfold. Kath slowly drew her sidearm, a decision she immediately regretted as the collective gasp from the assembled agents filled the underground chamber. In her weathered hands sat a 1911 pistol that looked like it had survived both world wars and possibly the Spanish-American conflict. The original Parkerized finish had worn away to bare steel in countless places, revealing the kind of honest wear that only came from decades of actual use. The grips were smooth wood that had been darkened by years of handling, and the sights, dear God, the sights were the original fixed iron posts that had come from the factory sometime around the Eisenhower administration. "Holy hell," whispered Agent Jennifer Rodriguez, a former Border Patrol agent whose own Springfield XDM was equipped with enough tactical accessories to stock a small gun store. "Kath, that thing belongs in the Smithsonian, not in a holster." The laughter started as a few scattered chuckles, but quickly built into something that echoed off the concrete walls, like a pack of hyenas discovering wounded prey. Agent Thompson stepped closer, his expression a mixture of disbelief and condescending amusement. "Seriously, Miller," he said, using her last name in the tone reserved for particularly slow children, "when was the last time that antique was serviced? I mean, do they even make parts for that thing anymore?" Kath's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind her dark eyes, not anger. "Exactly, but the kind of measured assessment that a professional makes when evaluating a potential threat." She'd learned long ago that the loudest voices in any room were usually compensating for something. And Derek Thompson's voice had been echoing through the embassy corridors for months now. "It was serviced last month," Kath replied evenly, her voice carrying just enough volume to cut through the laughter. "Same gunsmith who's been maintaining it for the past 15 years. Agent Chun shook her head in amazement. "Kath, honey, I'm not trying to be mean, but that pistol is older than some of our junior staff members. My grandmother's sewing machine is probably more technologically advanced than whatever you're carrying." More agents had gathered now, drawn by the commotion like sharks sensing blood in the water. The embassy's security team was a diverse group, former military, ex-law enforcement, private security veterans who'd worked protection details around the world. What they all had in common was an appreciation for cutting-edge equipment and a shared bewilderment at their colleagues' stubborn attachment to what appeared to be a genuine antique. Agent Williams pulled out his phone and began taking pictures. "I've got to document this," he announced to general laughter. "My buddies back in Detroit are never going to believe this. Federal agent in 2024 carrying a gun that probably saw action in the trenches of France." "Actually," corrected Agent Lisa Patterson, a former Secret Service agent whose knowledge of firearms bordered on encyclopedic. "Based on the markings I can see from here, that's probably a 1943 Remington Rand. They made them for the military during World War II. Kath, that thing is literally old enough to have fought the Nazis." The comment drew fresh waves of laughter and increasingly creative insults. Someone suggested that Kath should check with the museum curator upstairs to see if they had any black powder she could use for ammunition. Another agent wondered aloud if the embassy's antique firearms insurance policy was up to date. Through it all, Kath methodically continued her equipment check, examining her weapon with the kind of thoroughness that spoke of decades of ingrained habit. She checked the action, verified the magazine's condition, and inspected each round of ammunition with practiced efficiency. To an untrained observer, her movements might have seemed routine, almost boring. But Agent Rodriguez, who despite her participation in the general mockery had actually been watching carefully, noticed something that the others missed. Kath's hands never trembled. Not once. Even the slightest shake that came with caffeine, nerves, or simple human physiology was completely absent. Her movements were fluid, controlled, and utterly confident in a way that suggested muscle memory built through thousands of repetitions under conditions far more stressful than a basement firing range in a peaceful diplomatic compound. "You know, what the really sad part is," Thompson continued, clearly enjoying his role as the leader of this impromptu roast. "The State Department probably has a budget for equipment upgrades. Kath, you could literally walk upstairs, fill out a requisition form, and have a proper sidearm by next week. Something made in this century, with actual sights and maybe even crazy thought a functional safety system." Agent Williams nodded enthusiastically. "Derek's right. Hell, I've got a spare Glock in my office that I'd be happy to lend you. It's got night sights, a decent trigger, and it won't jam every time you look at it sideways." The suggestion drew approving murmurs from the assembled agents, as if they were staging an intervention for a colleague with a serious addiction to obsolete technology. Even Agent Chun, who generally tried to stay above the fray in office politics, found herself nodding along. "I mean, it's not even about the money," she added. "It's about effectiveness. What happens if you're in a real situation and that thing decides to have a mechanical failure? What happens when you need to make a shot that actually matters, and you're squinting through iron sights like some cowboy from the 1800s? The question hung in the air with the weight of genuine professional concern, temporarily dampening the laughter. These weren't just colleagues making fun of outdated equipment. They were federal agents whose lives might one day depend on each other's competence and reliability. The embassy might be located in a relatively stable country, but they all knew that international security could change in a heartbeat. Kath finished her inspection and looked up at the faces surrounding her. 20-something professionals, most of them carrying weapons that cost more than many people's monthly paychecks, all staring at her with expressions ranging from amused condescension to genuine bewilderment. She could have explained that her 1911 had never once failed her in 15 years of federal service. She could have mentioned that she'd carried it through 3 overseas assignments, including one where mechanical reliability had been the difference between coming home and becoming another casualty statistic. She could have pointed out that iron sights had been getting the job done long before red dot optics became fashionable, and that sometimes the simplest systems were the most dependable. Instead, she simply holstered her weapon and walked toward the firing line. "Where are you going?" Thompson called after her, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "You're not seriously planning to qualify with that relic, are you?" Kath paused at the boundary of the shooting area and turned back to face the group. For just a moment, her carefully maintained professional composure slipped, and something else showed through, something that made Agent Rodriguez take an involuntary step backward. "The qualification starts in 5 minutes, Kath said quietly. "I suggest you all get ready." As she walked away to set up at her assigned firing position, the laughter gradually died down, replaced by the kind of uncomfortable silence that follows when a joke goes too far. But none of them could have imagined that in less than 6 hours, Kath Miller's antique weapon would be the only thing standing between a coordinated terrorist attack and an international incident that would make headlines around the world. The embassy's monthly weapons qualification was about to become the least important test that any of them would face that day. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The firing line at the embassy's underground range was divided into 10 shooting stations, each equipped with electronic target systems that could simulate distances from 7 to 50 yards. The monthly qualification required agents to demonstrate proficiency at multiple ranges using both strong and weak hand shooting, with passing scores that reflected the high standards expected of diplomatic security personnel. Kath took her position at Station 7, the same spot she'd used for the past 3 years. To her left, Agent Thompson was making the show of adjusting his weapon's red dot sight and checking his custom grip tape. To her right, Agent Chen was running through her pre-shooting routine with the kind of theatrical precision that suggested she was very aware of being watched. Rangemaster Bob Sullivan, a grizzled former Marine whose weathered face had seen everything from boot camp to Beirut, stepped up to the control booth. At 62, Sullivan had been running this range longer than some of the agents had been alive, and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd earned respect through decades of consistent competence. "All right, ladies and gentlemen," Sullivan's voice boomed through the intercom system. "Today's qualification follows standard diplomatic security protocols. We'll start with strong hand shooting at 7 yards, move to 15, then 25, and finish with weak hand at 7 yards. You know the drill. Accuracy counts, but so does speed. In the real world, threats don't wait for you to find your perfect sight picture." The agents began preparing their weapons and settling into their shooting stances. The range fell into the familiar pre-qualification silence, that moment of focused concentration before the first command to fire. But the quiet was broken by Agent Williams, who apparently couldn't resist one final jab at Kath's equipment choice. "Hey Sullivan," Williams called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You might want to check if our insurance covers damage from antique firearms. I'm pretty sure that 1911 over there predates most of our safety protocols." The comment drew scattered chuckles from the other agents, but Sullivan's response surprised everyone. Instead of joining in the laughter, the old Marine walked down from his booth and approached Kath's station. His expression was unreadable as he examined her weapon setup. "Mind if I take a look at that pistol, Agent Miller?" Sullivan asked. his tone carrying none of the mockery that had characterized the morning's earlier comments. Kath nodded and handed over her 1911, watching as Sullivan examined it with the practiced eye of someone who understood firearms at a fundamental level. He checked the action, examined the trigger mechanism, and ran his finger along the worn but well-maintained finish. Remington Rand, 1943, Sullivan said quietly, more to himself than to the assembled agents. Serial number puts this one right. In the middle of the war production run. He looked up at Kath with an expression that the other agents couldn't quite read. This weapon has some history, doesn't it? Some, Kath replied simply, though something in her tone suggested there was far more to the story than she was willing to share. Sullivan handed the pistol back with what looked remarkably like reverence. Well then, he said, his voice carrying. Across the range, let's see what it can do. Agent Thompson rolled his eyes. Come on, Sullivan, you're not seriously going to pretend that piece of junk can compete with modern equipment. I mean, look at this setup. He gestured toward his own weapon, its tactical light gleaming under the range lights. Fiber optic sights. Match-grade barrel, precision trigger. That's what gets results in the real world. Maybe, Sullivan replied, returning to his control booth. But I've learned over the years that the most important part of any weapon system is the person holding it. Equipment can compensate for some things, but it can't replace fundamental skill. The comment seemed to hang in the air like a challenge, and Agent Chun seized on it immediately. Okay, but be realistic here. Modern sights, better ergonomics, improved ammunition, these advances exist for a reason. We're not using muskets anymore, because technology has improved our capabilities. Agent Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. It's not about being traditional or whatever. It's about being effective. When lives are on the line, you want every advantage you can get. Kath listened to the conversation while making her final preparations, her movements economical and practiced. She'd heard variations of this argument countless times over the years, in training facilities from Quantico to Glencoe, from colleagues who couldn't understand why anyone would choose simplicity over sophistication. Shooters ready? Sullivan called out, ending the debate with the authority of his position. Load and make ready. The familiar sound of slides being racked and magazines being inserted filled the range. Kath's 1911 made a distinctive metallic click as she chambered around. The sound somehow different from the polymer-framed pistols around her sharper, more mechanical, carrying the weight of decades of engineering refinement. 7-yard line, strong hand supported. On my command, you will fire 5 rounds for accuracy. Shooters ready? The agents settled into their shooting stances, a mixture of modified Weaver and isosceles positions, depending on their training backgrounds. Kath's stance was textbook, but somehow looked more natural than the others, as if she'd been standing that way for so long that it had become her normal posture. Ready on the right, ready on the left, ready on the firing line. Shooters, you may commence firing. The range erupted in a controlled symphony of gunfire. Thompson's Sig Sauer barked with the sharp crack of modern ammunition, while Chun's Glock produced its characteristic report. Williams' H&K contributed its own voice to the chorus, each shot fired with the precision that came from extensive training and confidence in superior equipment. And then there was Kath's 1911. The sound was different, deeper, more resonant, carrying a weight that seemed to cut through the other gunfire like a tuning fork through static. Each shot came with mechanical precision, spaced evenly in a rhythm that suggested absolute confidence in the weapon's performance. When the firing stopped and the electronic targets displayed their results, the laughter from earlier in the morning died completely. Thompson's target showed a respectable group, centered slightly left of the bullseye, good shooting by any standard, with 4 of 5 shots in the scoring ring. Chun had managed to keep all 5 shots in the target area, though. Her group was scattered across a 6-inch spread. Williams' shooting was solid, demonstrating the kind of competence expected from someone with his SWAT background. But Kath's target looked like it had been created by a machine. 5 holes, clustered so tightly in the center of the bullseye that they could have been covered by a silver dollar. The precision was so extreme that Agent Rodriguez actually walked down to the 7-yard line to examine the target more closely, as if she couldn't believe what the electronic scoring system was displaying. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Kath, how did you, that's not even humanly possible at 7 yards. Agent Patterson, whose encyclopedic knowledge of firearms extended to competitive shooting, was staring at the results display with undisguised amazement. "I've seen Olympic-level shooters who couldn't group that tight under controlled conditions. That's not just good shooting, that's something else entirely." The range fell silent except for the hum of the ventilation system. Even Sullivan, who'd been running qualifications for decades and thought he'd seen everything, was studying Kath's target with the expression of someone witnessing something genuinely extraordinary. 15-yard line, Sullivan announced, though his voice lacked its earlier commanding tone. "Strong hand supported, 5 rounds for accuracy." The second string of fire produced similar results. Thompson and the others shot well better than average, in fact, with the kind of precision that reflected their professional training and quality equipment. But Kath's shooting remained in a category by itself, producing groups that defied belief and challenged everything the other agents thought they knew about marksmanship fundamentals. By the time they reached the 25-yard line, the mockery from earlier had been replaced by something approaching awe. Kath's 1911 continued to perform with mechanical precision, placing shots exactly where she intended with a consistency that made her colleagues' high-tech equipment look crude by comparison. Agent Thompson found himself staring at his own target with growing frustration. His Sig Sauer was performing well better than well, actually, but compared to what Kath was accomplishing with her antique, his expensive modification seemed pointless. "I don't understand," Chun muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. "The sights on that thing are barely visible. There's no way she should be able to see her target that clearly at 25 yards. Agent Williams was examining his own weapon as if it had personally betrayed him. "Maybe there's something wrong with our lanes. Some kind of equipment malfunction that's affecting our accuracy." But Sullivan, who'd been watching from his booth with the attention of someone learning something new, shook his head. "Nothing wrong with the equipment. Sometimes you just see something that reminds you why fundamentals matter more than accessories." The final stage of qualification, weak hand shooting at 7 yards, should have been where Kath's age and traditional equipment finally showed their limitations. Shooting with the non-dominant hand was challenging under the best circumstances, requiring adjustments to stance, grip, and sight alignment that could trip up even experienced shooters. Instead, Kath's weak hand shooting proved to be just as precise as everything that had come before. 5 more shots, 5 more holes clustered in the center of the target, with the kind of precision that suggested the laws of physics were merely suggestions. The other agents stood in stunned silence, their expensive equipment and years of training suddenly feeling inadequate in the face of what they'd just witnessed. "Qualification complete," Sullivan announced, though his voice carried a note of wonder that hadn't been there at the beginning. "All shooters, make your weapons safe and secure your equipment." As the agents began packing up their gear, the underground range buzzed with quiet conversations and bewildered exchanges. The morning's confident mockery had been replaced by something much more complex: respect mixed with confusion, professional admiration tempered by wounded pride. Agent Rodriguez approached Kath as she was holstering her 1911, her expression a mixture of curiosity and genuine respect. "Kath, I have to ask, where did you learn to shoot like that? That wasn't just good marksmanship. That was something else entirely." Kath finished securing her weapon and looked up at her colleague. For just a moment, Something flickered behind her eyes, memories of training facilities and qualification courses that weren't listed in any official records, of instructors whose names were classified, and techniques that were never documented. In standard manuals, practice, she said simply. Lots and lots of practice. But as the agents filed out of the range and returned to their normal duties, none of them could have imagined that in less than 5 hours, they would understand exactly why Kath Miller had spent so many years perfecting skills that went far beyond standard diplomatic security requirements. The real test was still coming. The embassy's main security office occupied the second floor of the building, a sophisticated command center that monitored everything from the perimeter cameras to the encrypted communication systems that connected Valencia to Washington, D.C. Floor to ceiling, windows overlooked the embassy's front courtyard, where the American flag hung motionless in the still afternoon air. Regional Security Officer David Mitchell sat behind his mahogany desk, reviewing the morning's incident reports with the methodical attention that had served him well during 23 years of federal service. At 51, Mitchell had overseen security operations at embassies from Bangkok to Bogota, and he prided himself on maintaining facilities that ran with Swiss watch precision. The soft knock on his office door interrupted his concentration. "Come in," he called, not looking up from the stack of documents that seemed to reproduce themselves faster than he could process them. Agent Chun entered, her expression carrying the uncertain energy of someone who wanted to share information, but wasn't entirely sure why it mattered. "Sir, I wanted to talk to you about something that happened during this morning's weapons qualification." Mitchell set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, giving Chun his full attention. Jennifer Chun was one of his most reliable agents, thorough, professional, and not given to unnecessary drama. If she felt something warranted his attention, it probably did. "What kind of something?" Mitchell asked, gesturing for her to take a seat across from his desk. Chun settled into the chair, her hands folded in her lap as she tried to find the right words. "It's about Agent Miller, sir. Her performance during qualification was unusual." "Unusual how? Safety violation? Equipment malfunction?" "No, sir, nothing like that. The opposite, actually. Her shooting was—" Chun paused, searching for adequate description. "Sir, I've been doing this for 8 years. I've worked with some exceptional marksmen, including agents who competed at national levels, before joining federal service. What I saw this morning was beyond anything I've ever witnessed." Mitchell's eyebrows rose slightly. Kath Miller was a solid agent, reliable, experienced, never caused problems, but he'd never heard anyone describe her in terms that suggested exceptional anything. She kept to herself, did her job competently, and rarely drew attention to herself or her work. "Sarah, you're going to need to be more specific. What exactly did you observe?" Chun pulled out her phone and scrolled through several photos she'd taken of the morning's targets. "Perfect groups at every distance, sir. And I mean perfect holes you could cover with a quarter. Using iron sights on a pistol that has to be 70 years old." Mitchell examined the photos, his expression growing more serious with each image. He'd seen thousands of qualification targets over the years, and what Chun was showing him fell well outside the normal range of even excellent shooting. "These are her targets?" he asked, though the question was largely rhetorical. "Yes, sir. And it wasn't just the accuracy, it was the consistency. 5 shots at 7 yards, 5 shots at 15, 5 at 25, then 5 weak hand. Every string of fire looked exactly like these photos." Mitchell set the phone down and leaned forward, his fingers steepled as he processed this information. In his experience, agents who shot at this level usually came with documentation, competitive shooting backgrounds, specialized military training, instructor certifications. He'd reviewed Kath Miller's personnel file when she'd transferred to Valencia 3 years ago, and while her record was solid, nothing in it suggested marksmanship skills of this caliber. "Sarah, what do you know about Agent Miller's background?" Her training history, previous assignments? Chun shifted uncomfortably in her chair. That's part of what's strange, sir. I've worked with her for 3 years, but I realized this morning that I don't really know much about her previous experience. She transferred here from. Actually, I'm not sure where she transferred from. Her personnel file just lists previous federal service without specifics. This caught Mitchell's attention immediately. Embassy security positions required extensive background checks and detailed documentation of prior service. Vague references to previous federal service suggested either administrative oversight or deliberate classification, and in his experience, the latter was far more likely than the former. Has Agent Miller ever mentioned specialized training, military service? Competition shooting? Never, sir. She's always been quiet about her background. Professional, competent, but she doesn't share personal information the way most agents do. I always assumed she was just private by nature. Mitchell made a mental note to review Miller's complete file, including any classified attachments that might require higher clearance to access. Agents with backgrounds in certain programs, special operations, intelligence services, specialized federal units, sometimes carried documentation that wasn't immediately visible to standard personnel reviews. Is there anything else about this morning that struck you as significant? Chun hesitated for a moment, then nodded. The other agents, sir. Thompson, Williams, Rodriguez, they were all pretty shaken by what they saw. Thompson especially, he's been vocal about Agent Miller's equipment choices, and this morning's performance seemed to really get under his skin. Mitchell frowned. Derek Thompson was a capable agent, but his tendency toward arrogance and his need to be the alpha male in any group had caused friction since his arrival. The last thing Mitchell needed was wounded egos affecting team cohesion. I'll speak with Agent Thompson about maintaining professional attitudes, Mitchell said. Is there anything else? Actually, yes, sir. Rangemaster Sullivan made some comments that suggested he might know more about Agent Miller's background than the rest of us. He seemed familiar with her weapon, and he wasn't surprised by her performance the way the rest of us were. This was interesting. Bob Sullivan had been at the embassy longer than anyone, and his network of contacts throughout the federal law enforcement community was legendary. If Sullivan recognized something about Miller's background or capabilities, it was worth investigating. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Sarah. I'll look into it. After Chun left, Mitchell sat alone in his office, staring out at the peaceful courtyard below. Valencia was considered a low-threat posting stable government. Friendly relations with the United States, minimal terrorist activity. It was the kind of assignment where exceptional marksmanship skills rarely mattered, where most security challenges involved managing diplomatic protocols and handling the occasional overzealous protester. But Mitchell had learned over 2 decades of federal service that the most dangerous situations often developed in places where nobody expected them. Peaceful countries could become hostile overnight, and stable governments could collapse with frightening speed. Having an agent with capabilities that exceeded normal parameters wasn't a problem. It was an asset. He reached for his secure phone and dialed a number from memory. The call was answered on the second ring by a voice that belonged to Colonel Patricia Stewart, his former colleague who now worked in the Defense Department's Personnel Security Office. Pat, it's David Mitchell. I need you to run a background check for me, but I need the complete file. Everything, including any classified attachments or special program affiliations. What's the name? Catherine Miller, currently assigned to Embassy Valencia as Senior Security Officer. I'm seeing some indicators that suggest there might be more to her background than what's in the standard personnel file. There was a pause on the other end of the line. David, can you give me more specifics? What kind of indicators? Mitchell described the morning's shooting demonstration, emphasizing the level of precision that Chen had documented. As he spoke, he could hear Stewart typing in the background. presumably accessing databases that required specialized clearance. Interesting, Stewart said when Mitchell finished his summary. I'm seeing her name in the system, but there are some access restrictions that suggest prior service in specialized units. I'll need to make some additional calls to get the complete picture. How long do you think that will take? Give me a few hours. I should have something for you by end of business today. Mitchell hung up and returned his attention to the routine paperwork that comprised most of his daily responsibilities. But throughout the afternoon, he found his attention wandering to the windows, watching Kath Miller as she conducted her regular security patrols of the embassy grounds. From his second-floor vantage point, Miller looked like any other federal agent, professional, alert, moving with the practiced efficiency that came from years of training and experience. But knowing what he now knew about her capabilities, Mitchell found himself observing details he'd previously overlooked. The way she positioned herself during routine interactions, always maintaining clear sightlines and multiple escape routes. The unconscious habit of keeping her strong hand free and unencumbered, even during casual conversations. The systematic way she scanned the surrounding area, her eyes moving in patterns that suggested training far beyond standard diplomatic security protocols. At 4:15 p.m., his secure phone rang. David, it's Pat. I've got that information you requested, but we need to talk in person. What I'm seeing can't be discussed over unsecured lines. Mitchell felt a chill run down his spine. That's significant? Let's just say that Agent Miller's background is considerably more interesting than her current assignment would suggest. Can you be in D.C. tomorrow morning? Actually, no. We've got a high-level diplomatic meeting here tomorrow afternoon, and I can't leave the embassy. Then I'll send someone to you. Agent Rebecca Foster from our Special Programs Liaison Office will be on the morning flight to Valencia. She'll brief you on everything we've found. After Stewart hung up, Mitchell stood at his office window, watching. The afternoon shadows lengthened across the embassy courtyard. In a few hours, the day shift would end and the building would settle into its evening routine. The diplomatic staff would finish their meetings and reports. The administrative personnel would lock their files and turn off their computers, and the skeleton crew of security agents would begin their overnight watch. It should have been just another quiet day at a peaceful embassy in a friendly country. But Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at the calm before a storm. That somewhere in Kath Miller's classified background was information that would prove to be far more relevant than anyone could have anticipated. As he watched, Miller completed her perimeter check and disappeared around the corner of the building, her movements as professional and unremarkable as always. By tomorrow afternoon, Mitchell would understand exactly why the Defense Department maintained classified files on a seemingly ordinary embassy security officer. He would also understand why that information mattered far more than anyone could have imagined. The Valencia Grand Hotel's executive lounge buzzed with the quiet conversations of international businessmen and diplomatic officials, but the three men sitting in the corner booth were discussing matters that would never appear in any official minutes or treaty documents. Carlos Mendoza adjusted his expensive suit jacket and leaned forward, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of clinking glasses and muted television broadcasts. The timing has to be perfect, Mendoza said, his English carrying the precise accent of someone educated at European universities. The American delegation arrives at 2 p.m. tomorrow for the trade summit. Security will be focused on the formal proceedings, not on external threats. Across from him, Victor Petrov, a man whose passport identified him as a cultural attaché from an Eastern European nation but whose true affiliations were far more complex, nodded slowly. My contacts confirm that the embassy's security rotation follows predictable patterns. Day shift has 12 agents, night shift drops to 6. The transition period between 6 and 7 p.m. is when they're most vulnerable. The third man, James Hartley, looked distinctly uncomfortable with the direction of their conversation. His background in international finance had brought him into contact with individuals whose business practices operated in gray areas. But this was his first direct involvement in anything that could be classified as terrorism. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his whiskey glass. "I still don't understand why this is necessary," Hartley said, his American accent marking him as the outsider in this particular conspiracy. "The information you're after, surely there are less dramatic ways to obtain it." Mendoza's smile was cold and predatory. "Mr. Hartley, the documents we need are stored in the embassy's secure communications center. They contain details about American intelligence operations throughout Latin America, operations that have cost my organization millions of dollars in lost revenue. Traditional espionage methods have failed because the Americans have upgraded the security protocols." Petrov leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the lounge for potential surveillance. "What Carlos isn't telling you is that this operation serves multiple purposes. The intelligence gathering is important, but the real objective is psychological. A successful attack on an American embassy sends a message that nowhere is truly safe." Hartley's face went pale. "Attack? You said this was about obtaining documents. You never mentioned anything about attacking anyone." "Relax," Mendoza said dismissively. "We're not planning to harm the diplomatic staff. The embassy will be evacuated once we've secured the building. This is about making a statement and obtaining critical intelligence, not about creating casualties." But Petrov's expression suggested that the definition of acceptable casualties might be more flexible than Mendoza was admitting. The Russian had been involved in operations from Chechnya to Syria, and his understanding of collateral damage was considerably more pragmatic than his colleagues' public statements might suggest. "The plan is straightforward," Petrov continued, pulling out a tablet and showing the others a detailed architectural layout of the embassy building. 6-man team enters through the service entrance during the shift change. Secure the communications center on the 3rd floor. Download everything from their classified servers and extract before local authorities can respond effectively. Hartley studied the layout with growing unease. His role in the operation was supposed to be limited to providing intelligence about the embassy's daily routines, information he'd gathered during legitimate business meetings with American trade officials. But seeing the detailed planning and military precision of the operation made him realize he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "What about embassy security?" Hartley asked. "These aren't just administrative personnel. They're federal agents with combat training." Mendoza waved dismissively. "Diplomatic security officers are trained for protection and escort duties, not for responding to coordinated military-style attacks. They'll focus on evacuating the diplomatic staff, not on engaging armed intruders. By the time they organize any kind of meaningful resistance, we'll already have what we came for." This assessment was based on intelligence that was 3 years out of date, gathered when the embassy's security roster consisted entirely of agents with traditional law enforcement backgrounds. None of the conspirators were aware of recent personnel changes that had brought agents with more specialized training to the Valancia station. Petrov showed them a second screen displaying equipment specifications. Military-grade communications jammers will disable their radio systems and prevent calls for backup. Smoke grenades and flashbangs will create confusion and force the security team to focus on evacuation protocols rather than tactical response. "And if someone tries to play hero?" Hartley asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "Then they become a casualty," Petrov replied matter-of-factly. "But American embassy security officers are trained to prioritize protection of diplomatic personnel over building defense. Standard protocol calls for establishing secure perimeters around VIPs and evacuating to hardened positions, not for engaging superior forces." What none of them knew was that their intelligence about embassy security protocols was dangerously incomplete. The assumption that diplomatic security officers would follow standard evacuation Procedures was based on outdated assessments that failed to account for agents whose previous training had occurred in environments where retreat was never an option. Mendoza checked his watch, a Rolex that had been purchased with proceeds from operations that spanned 3 continents. Final confirmation from all teams by midnight tonight. Equipment staging at the warehouse by 6 a.m. tomorrow. Assault begins at 6:47 p.m., exactly 13 minutes into the shift change window. Hartley felt his stomach churning as the reality of what he'd helped set in motion became clear. Carlos, if this goes wrong, if people get hurt, the consequences will be ... The consequences will be profits. Mendoza cut him off sharply. American intelligence operations have cost our organization over $50 million in seized shipments and arrested personnel. This operation will provide us with enough intelligence to avoid future losses and identify the sources who've been feeding information to American authorities. Petrov closed his tablet and stood up, his movement signaling the end of their meeting. Gentlemen, by tomorrow evening, we'll either be celebrating a successful operation or dealing with the aftermath of failure. I suggest we all spend tonight preparing for both possibilities. As the 3 men left the hotel lounge separately, following predetermined routes designed to avoid surveillance, none of them were aware that their conversation had been overheard by a woman sitting at the bar who appeared to be reading financial newspapers on her tablet. Agent Rebecca Foster had arrived in Valencia that afternoon on a commercial flight from Washington, D.C., officially traveling as a State Department cultural liaison, but actually carrying credentials that provided access to information systems most federal agents would never see. Her assignment was to brief Regional Security Officer Mitchell about Kath Miller's classified background, but standard protocol required her to conduct a preliminary security assessment of the embassy's current threat environment. The Valencia Grand Hotel was a known gathering place for international business figures, whose activities occasionally intersected with American intelligence interests. Foster's presence in the lounge wasn't entirely coincidental. She'd been monitoring communications traffic that suggested increased activity among individuals whose organizations had previously targeted American facilities. But what she'd overheard went far beyond routine intelligence gathering. Foster waited 15 minutes after the last conspirator left the lounge before moving to a secure location and placing an encrypted call to her operations center in Washington, D.C. This is Foster, Agent Identification 77 Delta. I need immediate priority communication with Deputy Director Patterson. The call was routed through 3 separate secure systems before connecting her to a voice she recognized as belonging to one of the most senior officials in the Counterterrorism Division. Foster, what's your status? Sir, I'm in Valencia on a routine personnel briefing, but I've intercepted intelligence indicating an imminent attack on the American embassy. Organized group, military-style assault, targeting the communications Center for Intelligence Theft. There was a pause on the other end of the line. How credible is this intelligence? Very credible, sir. I observed a planning meeting between 3 individuals, including Carlos Mendoza. He's on our watch list for narcotics trafficking and anti-American activities. The operation is scheduled for tomorrow evening during the security shift change. Time frame for the attack? Approximately 6:47 p.m. local time. 6-man assault team, military equipment, coordinated to coincide with a high-level diplomatic meeting that will have most of the embassy's attention focused internally. Another pause, longer this time. Foster, I'm going to patch you through to the embassy's regional security officer. You'll brief him immediately on both the threat assessment and the classified information about Agent Miller. It appears that your personnel briefing has become significantly more relevant than we anticipated. As Foster prepared for what would be the most important briefing of her career, she couldn't help but wonder if the timing of these events was purely coincidental. Agent Miller's demonstration of exceptional marksmanship skills followed immediately by intelligence indicating an attack on her embassy, suggested either extraordinary bad luck or the kind of convergence that intelligence professionals learned to treat as potentially significant. By tomorrow evening, the question of coincidence would be irrelevant. The only thing that would matter was whether the embassy's security team was prepared for a level of threat that exceeded anything they'd trained for in their peaceful Valancia posting. And whether Agent Miller's mysterious background included the kind of experience that could turn the tide in a firefight that would determine the fate of American diplomatic personnel and classified intelligence assets worth millions of dollars. Mitchell's secure conference room had been designed to prevent electronic surveillance, with copper mesh embedded in the walls and white noise generators that made eavesdropping virtually impossible. At 7:30 a.m., the windowless chamber felt more like a bunker than a diplomatic office as Agent Rebecca Foster spread classified documents across the polished table. Mr. Mitchell, what I'm about to share with you regarding Agent Miller is classified. At the highest levels, Foster began, her voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to handling national security information. Before we proceed, I need your acknowledgement that this briefing falls under Special Access Program protocols. Mitchell nodded, his coffee growing cold as he sensed the gravity of what was about to unfold. In 23 years of federal service, he'd held security clearances that provided access to sensitive information, but Foster's precautionary measures suggested something beyond his normal experience. Agent Catherine Miller's official personnel file lists 15 years of federal service in various law enforcement capacities. Foster continued, opening a thick manila folder. What it doesn't show is that for 8 of those years, she was assigned to a joint task force that doesn't officially exist. She placed a photograph on the table, a much younger Kath Miller in military fatigues, standing with a group of individuals whose faces had been redacted with black markers. The background showed desert terrain and military vehicles that Mitchell recognized as specialized equipment used by counter-terrorism units. Operation Ghostwalker was a classified program that ran from 2010 to 2018. Foster explained, Joint CIA Special Operations Command Initiative designed to eliminate high-value targets in denied areas where conventional military operations weren't politically feasible. Mitchell studied the photograph, trying to reconcile the quiet embassy security officer he knew with the elite operative described in the documents. Agent Miller was military? Marines originally, force reconnaissance. But her test scores and psychological profile flagged her for special operations recruitment. She spent 2 years at classified training facilities that most people in our business have never heard of. Foster placed another document on the table, a summary of training completions that read like a catalog of the world's most advanced tactical programs. Advanced marksmanship, urban warfare, psychological operations, language training, survival and evasion, close quarters combat, explosives handling, intelligence gathering. Her specialty was long-range elimination of targets that posed threats to American interests, Foster continued. Between 2012 and 2016, Agent Miller completed 37 missions across 4 continents. The Pentagon classified her as one of the most effective operatives in the program's history. The numbers hit Mitchell like physical blows. 37 missions meant 37 human beings who had stopped breathing because Kath Miller was exceptionally good at her job. The quiet, professional woman who conducted routine security patrols around his embassy had eliminated more high-value targets than most special operations units accomplished in their entire existence. What happened in 2016? Mitchell asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Foster's expression grew somber. Mission in Eastern Europe went wrong. Agent Miller's partner was captured and tortured before being executed. She blamed herself for the tactical decisions that led to his death, requested immediate transfer out of special operations, and spent 2 years in psychological counseling before being cleared for return to federal service. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Miller's exceptional marksmanship skills, her unconscious tactical habits, her reluctance to discuss her background, all of it made sense in the context of someone who'd spent years operating in the shadows of America's most classified military programs. She chose diplomatic security as her new assignment, Foster continued. Specifically requested postings in low-threat environments where her specialized skills wouldn't be required. Valencia was supposed to be a quiet assignment where she could serve out the remainder of her federal career without ever having to take another human life. Mitchell looked up from the documents, his mind racing through the implications. Rebecca, why are you telling me this now? What's changed that makes Agent Miller's background relevant to embassy security? Foster's expression turned grim as she reached for another folder. Because approximately 12 hours ago, I intercepted intelligence indicating that this embassy is going to be attacked by a coordinated terrorist team, and Agent Miller may be the only person in this building with the training necessary to stop them. The briefing that followed lasted nearly 2 hours, during which Foster laid out everything she'd learned about the planned assault. Mendoza's organization, Petrov's military background, the detailed intelligence about embassy security procedures, the timing designed to coincide with the diplomatic meeting and shift change. 6 attackers with military-grade equipment, Mitchell summarized when Foster finished. Communications jamming, explosive devices, assault weapons. Their intelligence about our security protocols is 3 years old, but it's still largely accurate. The good news is that they're expecting to face standard diplomatic security officers, Foster replied. Agents trained for protection and evacuation, not for asymmetric warfare against superior forces. They have no idea that Agent Miller is on your security roster. Mitchell stood and walked to the wall-mounted map of Valencia, studying the embassies. Location relative to local police stations and military installations. Response time for local authorities? 12 to 15 minutes for police, 30 minutes for military units capable of handling this level of threat. If Mendoza's team executes their plan properly, they'll be inside the building for 20 minutes before any meaningful backup arrives. The mathematics were stark and unforgiving. 6 trained attackers with military equipment versus 12 embassy security agents trained primarily for protective duties, with no backup for at least 12 minutes. Under normal circumstances, the outcome would be predictable. The attackers would accomplish their objectives and extract with minimal resistance. But circumstances were no longer normal. I need to brief Agent Miller immediately, Mitchell said, turning back to Foster. She needs to understand what's coming and what her role might be in defending this facility. Foster nodded, but her expression suggested complications. Mr. Mitchell, there's something else you need to understand. Agent Miller specifically requested assignments where her special operations background wouldn't be relevant. She spent the past 3 years trying to distance herself from that part of her life. Asking her to resume that role, even temporarily, could have serious psychological consequences. Mitchell felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He was about to ask a woman who'd chosen peaceful service to prepare for a level of violence that would require her to kill multiple human beings. The ethical implications were staggering, but the alternative, allowing the embassy to be overrun by terrorists, was unacceptable. What's your assessment of her psychological readiness? Mitchell asked, unknown. Her counseling records suggest she's dealt with the trauma from her partner's death, but resuming operational status could trigger unpredictable responses. She might function at her previous level of effectiveness, or the psychological pressure might cause her to freeze at a critical moment. Foster gathered the classified documents and secured them in a briefcase designed to resist physical tampering. There's one more thing, Mr. Mitchell. Agent Miller's former commanding officer is now a colonel at Special Operations Command. If You decide to activate her for this threat. I can have him on a secure line within the hour to provide tactical consultation." Mitchell looked at his watch. 9:45 a.m. The diplomatic meeting would begin in 4 hours and 25 minutes. Attack would commence in 8 hours and 57 minutes. Somewhere in those intervening hours, he would have to transform his peaceful embassy security team into a tactical unit capable of repelling a military-style assault, and he would have to convince Kath Miller to become, once again, the weapon that the United States government had spent years training her to be. "Set up the call with her former commanding officer," Mitchell said finally. "And Rebecca, I need you to stay here through tomorrow evening. If this goes badly, we're going to need every qualified person we can get." As Foster left to make the necessary arrangements, Mitchell remained alone in the secure conference room, staring at the map of Valencia and trying to comprehend how a routine personnel briefing had become preparation for the defense of American diplomatic facilities against terrorist attack. In 8 hours, the sun would be setting over the peaceful streets of Valencia. By that time, Agent Kath Miller would either have returned to her role as one of America's most lethal operatives, or the embassy would fall to an enemy that had no idea they were about to face someone whose training had prepared her for exactly this kind of impossible situation. The only question was whether 3 years of peaceful service had dulled the edge that had once made her one of the most feared operatives in the American intelligence community. Kath Miller stood at the window of the embassy's third-floor communications center, watching afternoon shadows creep across the courtyard below. The diplomatic meeting had been underway for 2 hours, with trade officials from both countries working through complex negotiations that would determine economic relationships for the next decade. Everything appeared normal: security rotations running on schedule, administrative staff focused on their daily responsibilities, the peaceful rhythm of diplomatic life continuing uninterrupted. She had no idea that her world was about to change forever. The soft knock on the communication center door interrupted her routine equipment check. "Agent Miller?" The voice belonged to Mitchell, but something in his tone suggested this wasn't a standard administrative visit. "Yes, sir?" Kath turned from the window, immediately noting the tension in Mitchell's posture and the unusual formality of his approach. "I need you to come with me. There's something we need to discuss privately." The walk to Mitchell's office felt longer than usual, filled with the kind of weighted silence that preceded life-altering conversations. Kath's operational instincts, dormant for 3 years, but never truly gone, began to stir. Mitchell's body language, the deliberate route he chose through the embassy corridors, the way he glanced around before opening his office door, all of it suggested that whatever was about to happen fell outside the normal scope of embassy security operations. Inside the office, Kath was surprised to find a woman she didn't recognize, mid-30s, professional attire, carrying herself with the particular alertness that marked intelligence operatives. The stranger stood as they entered, extending her hand with the kind of confident grip that spoke of federal training. "Agent Miller, this is Rebecca Foster from the State Department's Special Programs Division," Mitchell said, though his emphasis on special programs suggested layers of meaning that wouldn't be apparent to casual observers. Foster's handshake lingered just long enough to convey significance. "Agent Miller, it's an honor to meet you. Your reputation precedes you." The comment hit Kath like ice water. For 3 years, she'd worked to ensure that her reputation was thoroughly buried, that Catherine Miller, the embassy security officer, bore no resemblance to the operator known in classified circles by a call sign she'd hoped never to hear again. Foster's words suggested that her careful anonymity had been compromised. "I'm not sure what reputation you're referring to," Kath replied carefully. Settling into the chair, Mitchell indicated, while maintaining visual contact with both individuals. Old habits of tactical awareness were reasserting themselves, despite her efforts to suppress them. Mitchell closed the office door and activated a small electronic device that filled the room with white noise. Standard protocol for discussing classified information. The precaution sent another chill through Kath's system, confirming that whatever was about to happen involved material far beyond routine embassy operations. Agent Miller, Foster began, opening a folder that Kath immediately recognized as containing classified documentation. We need to discuss Operation Ghostwalker and your service record between 2010 and 2016. The words hit Kath like physical blows, triggering memories she'd spent years learning to control. Ghostwalker had been the designation for missions that officially never happened. Operations conducted by people who didn't exist in any public records. Hearing that name spoken aloud in a diplomatic facility felt like a violation of everything she'd built since leaving that life behind. I don't know what you're talking about, Kath said automatically, the response ingrained through years of security protocols that demanded complete denial of special operations involvement. Foster placed a photograph on the desk, the same image she'd shown Mitchell earlier, with Kath's younger face clearly visible among the redacted figures. Agent Miller, we're past the point where denial serves any useful purpose. We know exactly who you are and what you've done. The question now is whether you're willing to do it again. Kath's hands began to shake, not with fear, but with the kind of adrenaline response that came from realizing that the peaceful life she'd constructed was about to collapse. What do you want from me? Mitchell leaned forward, his expression grave. At approximately 6:47 p.m. tonight, this embassy will be attacked by a 6-person terrorist team with military equipment and training. Their objective is to penetrate our communication center and steal classified intelligence, while eliminating anyone who attempts to interfere. The tactical part of Kath's mind immediately began processing the information timeline. Enemy strength, probable equipment loadout, likely approach routes. But the civilian part of her, the part that had chosen embassy security specifically to avoid this kind of situation, recoiled from the implications. You have 12 security agents, Kath said, though her voice lacked conviction. Standard protocols call for establishing defensive perimeters and evacuating diplomatic personnel. Local authorities can provide backup within 15 minutes. Foster shook her head. The attackers have jammers that will disable communications. They know our security protocols and have planned specifically to counter standard responses. Local police aren't equipped to handle military-grade weapons and tactics. By the time qualified backup arrives, the embassy will be overrun. Kath stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the courtyard where diplomats and staff members continued their normal activities, unaware that their lives would be in danger in less than 4 hours. The weight of what Foster and Mitchell were asking settled on her shoulders like the familiar burden of a sniper rifle. You want me to kill them, Kath said quietly, not turning from the window. We want you to protect American lives and classified information using whatever methods you deem necessary, Mitchell replied carefully. Your specialized training provides options that the rest of our security team doesn't possess. Kath closed her eyes and suddenly she was back in that warehouse in Prague, watching through her scope as enemy operatives tortured her partner while she lay motionless on a rooftop, unable to take the shot that might have saved his life. The guilt and trauma that had driven her from special operations came flooding back with devastating clarity. I can't, she whispered. I can't go back to that. Foster's voice was gentle but insistent. Agent Miller, I've reviewed your psychological evaluations and counseling records. You've dealt with the trauma from Prague. You're not the same person who made that impossible choice 3 years ago. You don't understand. Kath turned back to face them, her composure cracking for the first time since the conversation began. Every time I close my eyes, I see Marcus lying in that warehouse, bleeding out while I froze. I chose diplomatic security because I promised myself I'd never again be in a position where someone's life depended on my ability to take a shot. Mitchell stood and approached her, his expression compassionate but determined. Kath, tonight, Multiple lives will depend on your ability to take shots. Not just American diplomats and staff, but potentially hundreds of people if the intelligence these terrorists steal is used to plan future attacks. The weight of responsibility was crushing. But it was also familiar. For 8 years, Kath had carried the burden of knowing that her decisions with a rifle could determine whether American operations succeeded or failed, whether intelligence assets lived or died, whether terrorist networks continued operating, or were permanently disrupted. Foster opened another file, revealing surveillance photographs taken at the Valancia Grand Hotel. These are the men planning tonight's attack. Carlos Mendoza responsible for trafficking operations that have killed thousands of people through drug overdoses and violence. Viktor Petrov, former Spetsnaz operative, who's been linked to terrorist attacks in 3 countries. If they succeed tonight, the intelligence they steal will enable operations that will cost far more lives than stopping them will require. Kath studied the photographs, her trained mind automatically cataloging facial features, body language, probable skill levels. Despite her emotional resistance to returning to operational status, she couldn't stop her tactical assessment of the threats these individuals represented. The rest of your security team are good agents, Foster continued, but they're trained for protection and escort duties, not for asymmetric warfare against superior forces. Without your involvement, casualties among embassy personnel will be significant. The mention of her colleagues, Thompson with his arrogance, Chun with her dedication, Rodriguez with her curiosity about Kath's background triggered a protective instinct that overrode her personal reservations. These were people she'd worked alongside for 3 years, people who trusted her to help keep them safe. Mitchell placed a secure phone on his desk. Agent Miller, I have Colonel Harrison from Special Operations Command standing by. He's requested permission to speak with you about tonight's situation. Kath stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. Colonel Harrison had been her commanding officer during her final year with Ghostwalker, the man who'd signed her transfer orders after Prague and recommended her for the psychological counseling that had eventually cleared her for return to federal service. He knows about tonight? Kath asked. He knows everything, Foster replied. And he's prepared to provide tactical support and consultation if you decide to resume operational status. The decision crystallized in Kath's mind with sudden clarity. She could refuse Mitchell's request and spend the rest of her life knowing that people had died because she'd chosen personal peace over professional duty. Or she could accept that some responsibilities transcended personal comfort, that the skills the government had spent years developing in her came with obligations that didn't end when the missions became emotionally difficult. Kath reached for the secure phone, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to commit to. Patch me through to Colonel Harrison. As the call connected, Kath felt the familiar transformation beginning, the shift from civilian mindset to operational awareness. From embassy security officer to the weapon that 8 years of specialized training had created. In less than 4 hours, she would discover whether 3 years of peaceful service had dulled her edge, or whether some skills, once learned, were never truly forgotten. The choice had been made. Now came the hardest part: preparing to become once again someone capable of killing multiple human beings in defense of American interests. Colonel James Harrison's voice came through the secure phone with the crispness of someone accustomed to discussing life and death situations as routine business matters. Go 7, it's been too long. The call sign hit Kath like a physical blow, dragging her back to a world where human beings were reduced to numerical designations and success was measured in confirmed eliminations. She'd been Ghost 7 for 4 years, one of the most effective operatives in a program that didn't officially exist. Colonel, I'm not sure I'm ready for this, Kath said, her honesty surprising both Mitchell and Foster, who were listening on speakerphone. You're never ready, Ghost 7. That's not how this works. You train until readiness becomes irrelevant. until muscle memory takes over when conscious thought fails. Tell me about your current tactical situation. The familiar rhythm of operational briefings took over as Kath described the embassy layout, enemy strength assessment, and timeline constraints. As she spoke, she could feel her mind shifting into the analytical patterns that had kept her alive through 37 missions across 4 continents. 6 hostiles with military equipment and communications jamming capability, Harrison summarized when she finished. Defensive position with civilian personnel requiring protection. Limited backup availability. Ghost 7. This is exactly the kind of asymmetric engagement you specialized in. Foster leaned forward, her expression intent. Colonel, what's your tactical assessment? Can Agent Miller handle this level of threat acting essentially alone? Harrison's response was immediate and confident. Ma'am. Ghost 7 eliminated a 12-man terrorist cell in Sarajevo using nothing but a sidearm and improvised explosives. She held a position against superior forces in Syria for 6 hours until extraction arrived. If anyone can turn a defensive scenario into a tactical victory, it's her. But Kath was remembering Prague, remembering the moment when all her training had failed and her partner had died, because she'd hesitated at the critical instant. Colonel, what if I freeze again? What if the pressure causes me to make the same mistakes I made with Marcus? The line was quiet for several seconds before Harrison responded, his voice carrying the weight of command authority, tempered with genuine concern. Ghost 7, Prague wasn't your fault. You had 17 seconds to make an impossible shot through. A window at 300 meters in wind conditions that would challenge Olympic-level marksmen. The fact that you attempted the shot under those circumstances demonstrated exceptional courage. Marcus died because I missed. Marcus died because we sent a 2-person team into a situation that required a full squad. The mission parameters were flawed from the beginning. Your extraction saved 3 other operatives who would have been captured if you'd compromised your position, attempting an impossible rescue. Mitchell watched this exchange with growing understanding of the psychological burden Kath had been carrying. The guilt and self-recrimination that had driven her from special operations were based on tactical decisions that her commanding officer clearly viewed as professionally sound. Colonel, Mitchell interjected, what does Agent Miller need to maximize her effectiveness tonight? Access to her preferred equipment and the authority to coordinate defensive positioning for your entire security team. Ghost 7 was trained in small unit tactics. She can turn 12 diplomatic security officers into an effective fighting force if you give her operational command. Foster checked her watch, 3:47 p.m. Less than 3 hours remain before the attack. What about psychological preparation? How do we ensure that Agent Miller can function at operational levels? Harrison's voice took on the tone of someone who'd guided operatives through similar transitions countless times. Ghost 7, I want you to listen carefully. The person you've been for the past 3 years, the embassy security officer who avoids confrontation and maintains emotional distance, that person served an important purpose. She kept you safe while you healed from Prague. But tonight, you need to set her aside and remember who you were when lives depended on your ability to make impossible shots under impossible conditions. Kath closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. How do I do that, Colonel? How do I become someone I've spent 3 years trying not to be? By remembering that every terrorist you stop tonight is a terrorist who won't be alive to plan future attacks. Every shot you take in defense of that embassy prevents operations that could kill hundreds of innocent people. You're not just protecting diplomats and classified information, you're preventing future tragedies. The psychological reframe was exactly what Kath needed to hear. Instead of viewing tonight's operation as a return to a traumatic past, she could approach it as a continuation of the mission she'd always served, protecting American lives and interests against enemies who viewed civilian casualties as acceptable collateral damage. I'll need access to the embassy's weapons storage, Kath said, her voice becoming steadier as operational planning took precedence over emotional hesitation. And I'll need to brief the security team on defensive positions and engagement protocols. Mitchell nodded. Whatever you need. You have my full authority to restructure our security arrangements. Foster pulled out a tablet displaying detailed floor plans of the embassy building. Agent Miller, where do you want to establish your primary fighting position? Kath studied the architectural layouts with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years turning buildings into tactical advantages. The embassy's design included several features that could be exploited for defensive purposes: reinforced stairwells that would channel attackers into kill zones, hardened communication centers that could serve as fallback positions, and elevated positions that would provide clear fields of fire. Third floor communication center for primary observation and engagement, Kath said, her finger tracing potential sight lines on the floor plan. Secondary position on the second floor, overlooking the main entrance. Tertiary fallback to the basement armory if upper floors become untenable. Harrison's voice carried approval. Classic layered defense. Force them to fight through multiple prepared positions, while taking casualties at each level. What about civilian evacuation? Diplomatic personnel to the secure conference room on the first floor, Kath replied, her tactical planning becoming more detailed as she settled into operational mindset. It's designed to resist explosive entry and has independent communication systems that might function even with jamming in place. Foster made notes as Kath outlined her defensive strategy. What about the rest of the security team? How do you want to position them? Thompson and Williams have the most tactical experience. They'll anchor the primary defensive line on the second floor. Shun and Rodriguez will coordinate civilian evacuation and maintain communication with outside authorities. The remaining agents will establish overlapping fields of fire covering the main approach routes. Mitchell listened to this tactical discussion with growing amazement. The quiet embassy security officer he'd known for 3 years was transforming before his eyes into someone who spoke the language of warfare with native fluency. Every decision Kath made demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that exceeded anything in his experience with diplomatic security operations. Colonel Harrison, Mitchell said, what kind of casualty estimates are we looking at? If Ghost 7 executes this defense properly, enemy casualties should be 100%. Friendly casualties will depend on how well your security team follows her tactical guidance and whether the enemy has intelligence assets that provide them with detailed knowledge of Agent Miller's capabilities. The clinical assessment sent chills through everyone in the room except Kath, who was already mentally preparing for the kind of calculations that would determine who lived and who died over the next few hours. Colonel, I need to begin equipment preparation and team briefings, Kath said. Thank you for the tactical consultation. Ghost 7, one final thing. Remember that you're not fighting for the government tonight, or for classified information, or for diplomatic protocols. You're fighting for the people who trust you to keep them safe. That's what good operators do. They protect the people who can't protect themselves. As the call ended, Kath looked around Mitchell's office at Foster and Mitchell, both of whom were staring at her with expressions that mixed respect with something approaching awe. Agent Miller, Foster said quietly, I've read your operational records, but hearing you plan a defense is something else entirely. Kath was already moving toward the door, her mind focused on the dozens of tactical preparations that needed to be completed before 6:47 p.m. We have 2 hours and 43 minutes to turn a diplomatic facility into a fortress, and 12 embassy security officers into a military unit. If we're going to survive tonight, there's no time for anything except preparation. As she left Mitchell's office to begin the most important briefing of her career, Kath felt the final barriers between her peaceful present and her lethal past dissolving. In less than 3 hours, Ghost 7 would emerge from 3 years of dormancy to face an enemy that had no idea. They were about to encounter one of the most dangerous operatives in American intelligence history. The transformation was complete. Now came the hardest part, ensuring that her colleagues survived what was about to become a very different kind of diplomatic crisis. At 6:45 p.m., the Valencia embassy fell into the deceptive calm that preceded the storm. Diplomatic personnel had been quietly evacuated to the secure conference room under the pretense of an emergency drill, while the 12-member security team had taken positions throughout the building according to Kath's tactical plan. To any external observer, the embassy appeared to be operating under normal evening protocols. Kath Miller crouched behind the reinforced concrete barrier of the third-floor communication center, her vintage 1911 holstered at her side, and a borrowed M4 carbine resting across her knees. Through the reinforced windows, she had clear sight lines covering the embassy's main approaches. Her earpiece crackled with quiet status reports from the security team, positioned throughout the building. Ghost 7, this is Overwatch, came Agent Chun's voice from the basement command center. Multiple vehicles approaching from the east. 6 individuals with military equipment exiting 2 blocks away. The enemy was exactly on schedule. Kath's tactical mind automatically cataloged the information. 6 attackers as expected. Approaching. On foot to avoid the noise of vehicle engines, maintaining distance from the embassy until the final assault phase. Everything matched Foster's intelligence assessment. All stations, this is Ghost 7. Kath spoke quietly into her microphone. Target acquisition confirmed. Execute defensive protocols on my command. Remember, these are not criminals or protesters. These are military-trained operatives who will kill you without hesitation if you give them the opportunity. Agent Thompson's voice came through the comm system from his second-floor position. Ghost 7, I have eyes on 2 hostiles approaching the main entrance. They're carrying what looks like explosive charges. Confirmed. Maintain position until they breach the outer perimeter. Let them come to us. The next 90 seconds unfolded with the choreographed precision of a deadly ballet. The attackers moved with professional competence, using communication jammers to disrupt electronic systems and deploying smoke grenades to obscure their approach. But their intelligence about embassy security protocols was fatally outdated. They were expecting to face diplomatic security officers following standard evacuation procedures, not a coordinated defense organized by someone who'd spent 8 years turning impossible tactical situations into strategic victories. At 6:47 p.m. precisely, the embassy's main entrance exploded inward in a shower of concrete and steel. Contact front. Thompson's voice carried the controlled tension of someone engaging armed enemies for the first time in his federal career. Multiple hostiles entering through the main breach. Kath watched through her scope as the attack unfolded below. 3 attackers moved through the smoke-filled lobby with tactical precision, their assault weapons sweeping systematically as they advanced toward the stairwells. 2 more operatives flanked around the building's exterior, seeking alternate entry points. The 6th attacker remained outside, coordinating communications and providing overwatch. Williams Chen, you have 2 hostiles approaching the service entrance, Kath transmitted. Do not engage until they're fully committed to entry. Force them into the kill zone. The embassy's security team had never trained for this level of coordinated violence, but Kath's tactical guidance was transforming 12 individual agents into a cohesive defensive unit. Agent Rodriguez, positioned in the first-floor corridor, waited until the lead attacker passed her concealed position, before engaging with precision fire that dropped him instantly. 1 hostile down, first floor, Rodriguez reported, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her. But the attackers were adapting quickly to unexpected resistance. Instead of the panicked evacuation they'd anticipated, they were facing coordinated defensive fire from multiple positions. Mendoza's voice could be heard shouting orders in Spanish as his team realized their intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. Ghost 7. This is Thompson. They're using military tactics, bounding, overwatch, coordinated suppression. These aren't ordinary terrorists. Kath had already reached the same conclusion. The attackers' movement patterns and tactical coordination suggested special operations training, possibly Spetsnaz or similar elite units. But their expertise worked against them in this situation. They were executing plans designed for facing conventional security forces, not for dealing with someone who understood their tactics better than they did. All stations, shift to protocol. 7, Kath commanded. Force them up to the second floor. I need clean sight lines for precision engagement. The tactical designation meant nothing to most of the security team, but Thompson and Williams had enough military background to understand that Kath was orchestrating a deliberate withdrawal designed to channel the attackers into predetermined killing zones. The embassy's defensive positions were at random. They'd been chosen to create overlapping fields of fire that would allow a single skilled marksman to engage multiple targets while minimizing friendly fire risks. Agent Williams engaged the flanking team at the service entrance, his shots forcing them to seek cover in positions that exposed them to Kath's elevated firing position. The coordination was flawless. Williams created the tactical situation, and Kath exploited it with precision that eliminated 2 more attackers in rapid succession. 3 hostiles down, Kath reported calmly. Remaining 3 attempting to reach the second floor. All stations maintain defensive positions and await my command. But Petrov, the Spetsnaz operative leading the assault, had recognized that his team was facing something beyond ordinary embassy security. His tactical experience told him that the defensive coordination they were encountering required a level of professional competence that suggested military special operations involvement. All units priority shift to communications center, Petrov's accented voice carried through the smoke-filled corridors. Enemy has trained operative coordinating defense. Eliminate tactical commander first. Kath smiled grimly as she intercepted the transmission. The enemy had identified her as the primary threat, which meant they would abandon their original objective and focus on eliminating her position. It was exactly what she'd hoped for. By drawing their attention, she could protect the diplomatic personnel while creating opportunities for precise engagement. The remaining attackers began advancing up the stairwells with desperate urgency, knowing that their mission timeline was collapsing and that their only chance of success lay in eliminating the tactical coordinator who had turned their assault into a disaster. Agent Chun's voice crackled through the comm system. Ghost 7, I'm tracking movement toward your position. 2 hostiles, second floor stairwell, moving fast. Confirmed. All stations prepare for final engagement phase. What happened next? Lasted less than 30 seconds, but would be analyzed by tactical instructors for years afterward. As the 2 remaining attackers reached the 3rd floor corridor, they found themselves in a perfectly constructed crossfire. Kath had positioned herself not just for optimal shooting angles, but to force the attackers into a tactical trap where their own expertise worked against them. Petrov entered the communication center corridor first, his assault rifle sweeping for targets with professional competence. But his training had prepared him to face conventional opponents using conventional tactics. He had no experience dealing with someone who could place shots with surgical precision. While under fire from multiple directions, Kath's first shot took Petrov's center mass at 40 meters, her 1911 barking with the same mechanical precision she'd demonstrated during the morning's qualification. The second shot, fired less than 1 second later, eliminated the final attacker before he could acquire her position. The embassy fell silent, except for the distant wail of police sirens and the crackling of flames from the destroyed main entrance. All stations, this is Ghost 7. Threat eliminated. Casualties report. The responses came back quickly. Agent Rodriguez had suffered a minor shrapnel wound, and Agent Williams had been grazed by rifle fire, but no fatalities among the embassy security team. 6 attackers had entered the building. 6 attackers would be carried out in body bags. Agent Thompson's voice carried a note of awe that he couldn't quite suppress. Go 7. That was... I've never seen anything like that. Mitchell's voice came through the comm system from the secure conference room. Outstanding work, people. Local authorities are securing the perimeter now. As Kath safeguarded her weapons and began the post-engagement, procedures that had been drilled into her through hundreds of training scenarios, she realized that something fundamental had changed. The guilt and trauma that had driven her from special operations hadn't disappeared, but it had been balanced by something more important, the knowledge that her skills could still be used to protect innocent people. Agent Chun appeared in the communications center doorway, her expression mixing professional respect with personal gratitude. Kath, I know I don't understand everything that happened here tonight, but I want you to know that you saved all our lives. Foster arrived with the local authorities, her face showing the relief of someone who'd gambled on an operational assessment and seen it vindicated. Agent Miller, preliminary reports indicate that the attackers were planning to use stolen intelligence for operations across 3 countries. By stopping them here, you've prevented attacks that could have killed hundreds of people. As emergency responders secured the embassy and investigators began processing the scene, Kath found herself standing once again at the 3rd-floor window, looking out at the courtyard where evening shadows were giving way to the harsh illumination of police floodlights. Agent Thompson approached hesitantly, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility. Kath, I owe you an apology. This morning I thought your equipment was outdated. Your methods were primitive. I had no idea what you were capable of. Kath turned from the window, and Thompson saw something in her expression that suggested hard-won wisdom rather than professional pride. Derek, the most important lesson from tonight isn't about equipment or tactics. It's about understanding that sometimes the quiet ones, the people who don't feel the need to prove anything, are quiet for a reason. Mitchell joined them, carrying official documentation that would transform tonight's events into classified reports and congressional briefings. Agent Miller, I've just received word from Washington. You're being offered a position with the Counter-Terrorism Response Team, effective immediately. Full reinstatement to Special Operations status with your choice of assignments. Kath considered the offer for a moment, then shook her head with a slight smile. Thank you, sir, but I think I'll stay right here. Turns out I'm exactly where I need to be. As the embassy settled into the controlled chaos of post-incident investigation, Kath realized that she'd found something she hadn't expected, a way to use her deadly skills in service of life rather than death, a purpose that honored both her operational capabilities and her desire for peace. The morning's weapons qualification had revealed her exceptional marksmanship skills. Tonight's assault had revealed something more important, that true strength often came disguised as quiet competence, and that the most dangerous people were usually the ones who looked the least dangerous at all. In the secure aftermath of a battle that would never appear in public records, Agent Catherine Miller had learned that some abilities, once developed, carried obligations that transcended personal comfort. And sometimes fulfilling those obligations was the only path to genuine peace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.